In the United States, food insecurity is unevenly distributed. Recent data suggests that white households have nearly a third to one-half the food insecurity rate of Black and Hispanic households. While research on the reasons for food insecurity typically focuses on income, a body of research suggests that wealth could be an important factor in food insecurity. According to today's guest, quote, land is one of the major sources of wealth controlled by Black families in the South, and much of this land continues to be owned as heirs property, end quote. Thus, if we want to understand differential food insecurity, we may need to consider the wealth implications of heirs property. Welcome to the Leading Voices in Food podcast. I'm Norbert Wilson, a professor of public policy at Duke University and the director of the World Food Policy Center. Connor, it is a pleasure to have you here today.
Norbert, great to be with you.
Connor, recently, the topic of heirs property has attracted much attention from researchers, policymakers, and civil society. Can you briefly describe the phenomenon of heirs property and why you think it's important?
I think of heirs property as, in a phrase, the legacy of Jim Crow. And by that, what I mean is that during the Jim Crow era, imagine you're, say, 1880, you're 15 years after the end of the Civil War, and you're a Black farmer and you've bought some land. Are you going to write a will to pass that property down to your heirs? Probably not, because your access to education is pretty limited. And moreover, there are no Black lawyers because where are the Black lawyers going to come from if there's no education for Black people, right? That's the Jim Crow era. And so what's your choice? You're now going to go to the white lawyers or the courthouse gang that you simply don't trust. The whole legal system is something that Black farmers, Black people generally, fundamentally did not trust. This is the era of lynching, after all, when people would be pulled from their homes and in front of the law, nobody would be able to say who perpetrated these crimes. So it was a difficult time for African Americans, for Black people, for Black farmers generally. And they wouldn't write wills because they didn't trust the legal system. So what we end up with is that family that bought land in, say, 1880, and they pass on, and the next generation and the next generation, they're still not writing wills. We know that many people don't have wills. I don't know, Norbert, if you have a will, and I don't need to know. But the fact is, many people, white and Black alike, and Hispanic and others, in this country don't have wills, but when they die, they're able to sort things out before it passes on to the next generation and becomes increasingly complex and confused and tangled. And that's not true in the case of African Americans and some other politically marginalized populations, white people in Appalachia, Hispanics, Native Americans, Hawaiians. Heirs property is not just a Black phenomenon in the South, though that's where my research and most research on heirs property has been. What we end up with in the case of the Black South is heirs property is something that is multi-generational. It's not simply dying without a will, intestacy, but it's the dying without a will over multiple generations so that you end up with maybe 200 people who own a house or a piece of property, farm or some forest land. How do you make decisions in a situation like that on maintaining a house or improving the farmland or planting trees or whatever it is you're going to do with that property? How are you going to go to a bank and say, I want a mortgage? Well, they're going to say, well, how do we know who's got the rights to sign on a mortgage? So there's no access to commercial credit. And until very recently, and we can come back to this later, Black farmers had no access to government credit programs through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, could not get credit loans. If you were in the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans and you were wiped out by Hurricane Katrina, you had no access to FEMA support because you did not have clear title. Heirs property, it's a form legally called tenancy in common, and that means you don't have clear title. Nobody has clear title. Everybody owns a share of the property as a whole. Now, one of the reasons it's important is it's not a small phenomenon. Today, based on research that I've done with my colleague Ryan Thompson at Auburn University, there are in the 11 states of Appalachia and the South, 5.4 million acres of heirs property worth something like $43 billion. And that's after enormous amounts of land have been lost through predatory actions, legal but predatory partition sales, tax sales, and the like. Heirs property is a source of vulnerability. People have lost property in large areas. That whole stretch of coast in the South Atlantic from Myrtle Beach down to Jacksonville, Florida, all that resort land, that was Black-owned land until after World War II. In the 1950s, once malaria was controlled in that area, bridges were built to the sea islands, developers followed, and properties were basically stolen through legal means, through something called a partition sale. And now you've got this enormous resorts being built there, much money being made, but these people who lived there for generations have been dispossessed. So why is it important? It's for all these reasons, these moral reasons, for the impact of the fact that you've still got millions of acres that's tied up in heirs property that people can't develop and utilize effectively for farming or forestry or even for their homes. It's one of the main reasons for wealth disparities, as you mentioned at the outset, Norbert, that the wealth disparities between white and black are enormous. The St. Louis Fed just last month put out a study that showed that for every dollar of wealth that white Americans own, Black Americans own 24%. Black Americans own very much less wealth. And heirs property is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons because lands have been stolen, lands have been lost, and those lands that still remain in heirs property, 5+ million acres just in the South in Appalachia, are underdeveloped, underutilized, and underpreserved.
Thank you for that. And Connor, I want to ask you a question about trust. It's in the paper, and you mentioned it earlier, this idea of African-American, Black households, Black individuals not trusting the legal system. The reason I want to push on this is one could argue that trust could be because you may not know any better, or you don't have enough information. We don't trust strangers because we just don't know what they could do. And I'm wondering if another way of looking at this, something I've learned from people who do work on bioethics, Wyland Wilson here at Duke, and others have talked about this, about the systems being untrustworthy. And it's not that people aren't aware or can't navigate, but rather that the system or the institutions have proven not to do right by individuals. How does that characterization sit with the work that you've been doing?
Well, when I've been working on heirs property, as I have for 15, 16 years now, this phrase, Black farmers, property owners generally did not trust the legal establishment, didn't trust lawyers, the courthouse gang. That's an easy statement to make. But as I started looking at the literature on heirs property, there wasn't a lot of background to that. So I spent several months reading a bunch of older literature, W.E.B. Du Bois, Arthur Raper, and others, who were documenting what it meant to be Black in the rural South in the early decades of the 20th century. And it's very clear to me that Black property owners and Black residents of that region as a whole had very good reasons not to trust the legal system. It was used against them in many cases. People simply avoided going to the courthouse whenever possible.
Now, this is an important point, and so thank you for exploring that with me. I've got to ask, I know you were at Auburn University, you're now retired, but what led you to study heirs property and unearth its importance? Why are you still doing this work?
The second question is very easy to answer, but also very important. There is a moral quality to the research that is done on heirs property. The work that I'm doing and others, and I'm not the only one, the work that we are doing has a moral quality to it. We're trying to identify problems and redress wrongs. That's what gets me up in the morning. I mean, I'm 7.5 years out from retirement, but I'm still publishing on this topic because it's important. Now, how did I come to realizing that? From a very good graduate student of mine named Janice Dyer, who was working in West Alabama on a different project, having nothing to do directly, we thought at the time, on heirs property. It was really on small-scale wood harvesting and processing so that people could build homes using wood that's on the land that they owned. And Janice came back after spending some time out in the field and said, hey, there's this thing, heirs property. People don't have clear title to their land. And I said, oh, okay. And I'd read a little bit about that, but she said, no, this is a really important thing. Pay attention. Okay, Janice, I'm going to pay attention. And, here I am 16 years later, I'm still paying attention. One of the reasons professors get better at their jobs, and Norbert, you should appreciate this, is that we work with really bright students over time, and we gain so much from working with these students and undergraduates as well. And so, I came to this because a graduate student pulled me into it and said, pay attention. This is important.
Thank you for that. I do agree there is something critical about engaging students to understand the topic. And I want to actually take that a step further because I know of some of the other work that you've done. How have you engaged communities in this work? Obviously, this is not a ivory tower kind of issue. This is something that affects the livelihoods of everyday people. How and in what ways are you engaging that community of folks?
Well, I work with people in civil society organizations like the Center for Heirs Property Preservation in Charleston, South Carolina, created by a woman named Jenny Stevens back in the early, I think, 2004 or 5, something like that, and other organizations that represent people who own heirs property. I've been working with people in the legal community through the Uniform Law Commission and all kinds of other groups. So it's simply a matter of understanding that what we can do in the ivory tower is important because we can document the extent of heirs property, for example. And that doesn't take working with communities, but we need to be working with people in communities affected by heirs property so that we understand the real significance of it and to keep the moral energies flowing. So, for example, my co-author on a couple of recent papers, Ryan Thompson at Auburn, he did his doctoral dissertation with the Gullah Geechee in South Carolina, which is near where Jenny Stevens and the Center for Heirs Property Preservation is located. Ryan worked actually far more closely with people who were heirs property owners and organized around that issue than I have done. But so it's really important to understand from the people who are living the life of heirs property owners and who are facing the struggles to understand what are the issues so that as researchers we can try to address those issues and try to come up with policy recommendations that might be helpful.
Great, thank you. One of your recent publications, titled Heirs Property, Critical Race Theory, and Reparations, recently won the annual Rural Sociological Society's Best Paper of the Year award. First, congratulations, but secondly, explain your approach and your findings.
Well, as I was saying earlier, I was looking at the question of trust, the trust of Black property owners and Black residents of the South to the legal system. And as I was reading that literature, the idea of critical race theory simply emerged into my consciousness. I did not start off my reading saying, okay, I'm going to go look for evidence that's going to show critical race theory. Rather, it kind of emerged because critical race theory talks about the long-standing, deep institutional patterns of discrimination that are built into our legal system, our cultural system, our educational systems. And they are so deeply ingrained that we often don't even recognize them, or we consciously sometimes ignore them. But there are discriminations built deeply into our systems, sometimes that we don't recognize. And what heirs property represents, as I said at the very outset, the legacy of Jim Crow. The legacy of Jim Crow is all these institutional limitations placed on Blacks in terms of access to education, legal services, and commercial loans, insurance for their properties, redlining in cities of where you could get government assistance or not. All these things are built in and are deeply embedded. And even though we have removed many of the outward mechanisms and trappings of racial discrimination, these patterns are still there. And to speak of heirs property in terms of critical race theory simply made sense. It emerged, the realization in my mind that this phenomenon of heirs property is rooted in these institutional relationships. It sort of hit me between the eyes with a 2x4. I was like, wow, this is a perfect use of a theory to help explain a phenomenon. And that's what academics, we should be pretty good at that. But that's what I've basically done. I don't think of myself as a theoretician, but the theories help us understand, okay, here are the key variables, the key phenomenon that we need to focus on if we're going to understand that particular phenomenon. The question of reparations, which is the last term in that title, refers specifically to the Gullah Geechee. And I was talking about earlier about that stretch of land. It's now billion-dollar resorts. And it's unrealistic to think that anybody's going to come and take that land away from Hilton and Sheraton and all these major corporations and give it back to the Gullah Geechee. That's just not realistic. But what if we charged a 1% lodging tax? There are already people coming and using those resorts are already paying 6 and 7% on top of their bill for police and fire protection and things for the local counties and municipalities. What if we added 1% and gave it to the Gullah Geechee? There's a couple of entities, and I'll leave it to others to make that decision but there's the Gullah Geechee Nation, and there's also a federally mandated Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. It's a 501c3 organization. Monies from that could be utilized to support the Gullah Geechee in clearing title for their remaining heirs' property, or for buying new properties to replace those that have been stolen legally, but still stolen. And so to support the subsistence fishing and farming activities that have supported the Gullah Geechee for many, many generations, dating back to the post-Civil War era.
Thank you for that. And this is going to really move us into this last question that's connecting this idea of, and I appreciate how you talked about how theory can help us as researchers do the work that we do, but then there are implications of that theory to actual policy and the lived experiences of folks. So my question is, how has the research that you and others have done on heirs property affected policy at the local, state, or even federal levels?
As I said, there's a large number of researchers and others working on heirs property. And I want to give a shout out to a couple of organizations that have been really critically important. The Southern Rural Development Center based at Mississippi State has become a really important convener of a lot of us working in this heirs property space. We have regular monthly Zoom calls. We have subcommittees on research on policy and on education and extension that meet regularly. There's a policy center at Alcorn State University that has become very important in helping organize and support research on heirs property. And there's the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta that has also served as a convener and bringing people together. So we've got individuals, but we've also got some really important institutional actors that are providing continuity for those of us who are wanting to find a mechanism to interact, but they're providing that mechanism. So there's a lot of people working on the question of heirs property. It's becoming increasingly visible, not only in the research space, but also among policymakers. So that, for example, in the 2018 Farm Bill, there was wording introduced and passed in the 2018 Farm Bill that allowed heirs property owners who were farming land to gain access to what's called a farm number through the Farm Service Agency. The farm number is critical because if you have a farm number, you can now get a loan from USDA. Before that, heirs property owners could not. Basically, farmers operating heirs property now, for the first time, have access to credit through the USDA. And that's a very important step forward. It actually came from a South Carolina Republican Senator, Scott, and an Alabama Democrat, Doug Jones, who worked up the wording on this, and it got later placed into the Farm Bill. The other thing that's happened is that FEMA, I mentioned Katrina earlier, FEMA has revised their policies so that now if you can prove you've lived in that home, you've lived on that property, you've paid property taxes, you've got maybe home insurance or whatever, if your property is damaged, destroyed in a natural disaster, a storm, FEMA will now help you. But 10 years ago, that was not the case. This happened only in the last couple of years. The point is, people have started to pay attention to heirs property. And I got to say, people working in the media and Politico, in the Atlantic, in the New York Times, and the Washington Post, they've picked up on this. They've called researchers. They've called people like me and my colleague Ryan, and they've gotten the facts from us, and they've developed it. They've gone and interviewed people, and they've developed the stories. And the media has also drawn a lot of attention to the issues associated with heirs property. So it's been kind of a full court press. We've all been moving forward on this.
Thank you for that. And I also know that, for example, the Economic Research Service in the last couple of years have been really doing some work on heirs property. And then there's the legal community that's also been working on this, particularly Thomas Mitchell, who's now at Boston College, but was at Texas A&M, has done some important work in this space. So I really do appreciate this idea that it's government, it's academics from different disciplines, and also community organizers that are moving this conversation forward. I've seen how Heirs property can cause so much damage, disruptions in families, and of course, the implications on wealth are without question. And so I'm really grateful for the work that you and so many others have done in this space. Connor, it has been such a pleasure. And I have to say, I've known Connor, I've known you for a long time. We were colleagues at Auburn University, and I do appreciate the work that you've been doing over the years on this and so many other topics that are relevant for states like Alabama, but beyond. So it's been really a pleasure to reconnect with you today. Today's guest is Connor Bailey, Professor Emeritus of Rural Sociology at Auburn University. Thank you for listening. If you would like to subscribe to the Leading Voices in Food podcast series, you can find it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Podcasts and transcripts are also available on the website of the World Food Policy Center. This is Norbert Wilson.